On the morning of August 7, 1942, Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, crouched in his concrete observation post overlooking the Strait of Messina, watching American landing craft gather off the coast of Sicily through field glasses that had served him since the Africa Corps. At 34 years old, he commanded artillery observation for the Hermann Göring Panzer Division's coastal defense sector, coordinating fire from positions the German High Command considered safely beyond the range of any naval weapon in the Allied arsenal. His bunker sat 18 miles inland from the nearest beach, positioned on high ground that offered perfect visibility over the invasion routes while remaining comfortably distant from the maximum range of Allied destroyer guns. The Germans had learned hard lessons about naval gunfire support during earlier amphibious operations, carefully studying Allied capabilities to position their artillery and command posts beyond the reach of ship-based weapons. Intelligence reports confirmed that American destroyers mounted 5-inch guns with a maximum range of 10 miles, while even their heavy cruisers could not effectively engage targets beyond 15 miles from the coastline. Hartmann's position at 18 miles represented a calculated buffer, close enough to direct counter-battery fire against landing zones, while remaining immune to naval bombardment that had proven so devastating to coastal defenders on other fronts. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning air carried the distant rumble of naval gunfire as Allied warships began their preliminary bombardment of the beaches, a sound Hartmann had grown accustomed to over 3 days of preparation. The shells fell in predictable patterns against coastal fortifications, following the standard doctrine of softening beach defenses before infantry came ashore. His radio crackled with reports from forward observation posts describing the bombardment's intensity, but the tone remained confident. The Americans were expending enormous quantities of ammunition against concrete bunkers designed to withstand such punishment, following procedures that German defensive doctrine had already accounted for in the defensive planning. Then at 0645 hours, Hartmann heard a sound that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the horizon, a deep bass note that resonated in his chest before his ears registered it as actual sound. Through his high-powered optics, he watched the massive silhouette of USS Arkansas adjust her position 8 miles offshore, her 14-inch gun turrets rotating with mechanical precision toward targets that should have been far beyond her effective range. The battleship's profile was familiar from intelligence briefings, an old dreadnought from the First World War that American planners had relegated to shore bombardment duties because she lacked the speed for fleet actions. What happened next would shatter every assumption German artillerists had made about the tactical geography of amphibious warfare. The first shell from Arkansas's main battery screamed overhead at a trajectory that seemed impossible, the sound building from a distant whistle to a freight train roar that made Hartmann's concrete bunker vibrate like a tuning fork. The projectile, weighing 1,560 pounds, traveled in a high arc that carried it not toward the beaches 10 miles away, but toward Hartmann's artillery positions 18 miles inland from the coast. The impact crater that appeared 400 yards to his left measured 40 feet across and 20 feet deep, the explosion sending a column of Sicilian soil and shattered bedrock high into the morning sky. Hartmann pressed his face against the observation slit, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The Americans had somehow reached his position from a distance that every manual, every intelligence report, every tactical assessment had declared impossible for naval gunfire. His radio operator looked up from the equipment with confusion, replacing the confidence that had characterized German communications all morning, whispering words that would echo through Wehrmacht defensive planning for the remainder of the war. "Herr Oberleutnant, they're shooting at us from the sea." The silence that followed the first impact felt heavier than the explosion itself, as Hartmann tried to reconcile observed reality with everything he understood about naval artillery capabilities. His training at the artillery school in Göteborg had covered naval gunfire extensively, with instructors emphasizing the importance of positioning observation posts and command centers beyond the maximum range of ship-based weapons. The curriculum had used real-world data from the Royal Navy and American fleet, calculating maximum ranges based on gun elevation, propellant charges, and projectile ballistics. Those calculations had placed his bunker in a zone of absolute safety, protected by simple physics from any threat the Allied fleet could pose. Through his optics, Hartmann could see Arkansas's forward turret elevate to an angle that seemed absurdly high, nearly 45 degrees above horizontal. The battleship's fire control systems, primitive by later standards but representing the cutting edge of ballistic computation for their era, were solving trajectory problems that German planners had assumed were impossible for shipboard weapons. The Americans had discovered that by using reduced propellant charges and extreme elevation angles, they could lob 14-inch shells in high arcs that carried far beyond the normal maximum range, trading velocity and accuracy for the ability to reach targets that should have been safe from naval gunfire. The second salvo arrived with less warning than the first, a bracket of 3 shells that impacted in a line extending from Hartmann's position toward the artillery park 200 yards behind him. The ground shook with impacts that registered on seismographs as far away as Malta, each explosion creating shock waves that rattled equipment in bunkers designed to withstand direct hits from 105mm howitzers. Dust cascaded from the concrete ceiling as the observation post swayed on its foundation, the steel reinforcement groaning under stresses the engineers had never anticipated when they designed the structure. Private Werner Schmidt, a veteran artilleryman from the Russian front, who had transferred to coastal defense, seeking respite from the grinding warfare in the east, looked up from his plotting table with eyes that showed the first signs of the fear that would soon spread through the entire defensive sector. "Herr Oberleutnant," Schmidt said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tremor in his hands, "if they can reach us here, there is nowhere safe. Our entire fire plan assumed we could coordinate from protected positions. If the Americans can bombard observation posts this far inland, how do we direct our own artillery?" The question captured the fundamental tactical shift that was occurring along the Sicilian coast as American battleships demonstrated capabilities that overturned established assumptions about amphibious warfare. The German defensive doctrine had been built on the premise that artillery and command positions could be placed beyond naval gun range, allowing defenders to coordinate fire against landing forces without fear of counter-battery bombardment from ships. This assumption had shaped everything from bunker placement to communication networks to ammunition storage locations. If American warships could reach targets 18 to 20 miles inland, the entire defensive architecture became vulnerable to systematic destruction. Hartmann's sector formed part of a defensive network that extended along the southern Sicilian coast, with artillery positions carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire over the invasion beaches, while remaining protected from naval gunfire. The Hermann Göring Division had spent 3 months preparing these positions, using Italian labor to construct concrete bunkers and ammunition magazines that represented a significant investment of scarce resources and engineering expertise. The placement of each position had been calculated based on maximum naval gun ranges derived from intelligence assessments that now appeared catastrophically wrong. The radio brought confused reports from other observation posts along the defensive line, each describing similar impacts from naval shells that were reaching positions German planners had considered absolutely safe from ship-based weapons. Observation Post 7, located 19 miles from the coast on high ground overlooking the Gela Plain, reported direct hits from what appeared to be 16-inch projectiles fired from USS Nevada. Observation Post 3, positioned 18.5 miles inland to coordinate fire against the American landing zones, had gone silent after a sustained bombardment that witnesses described as methodical and precise despite the extreme range. The tactical implications became clear as Hartmann studied his maps and tried to comprehend the new reality of naval gunfire capabilities. Every German artillery position, every command bunker, every ammunition dump that had been sighted based on the assumption of safety beyond 15 miles now lay within range of American battleships that were demonstrating an unexpected ability to engage targets at distances approaching 20 miles. The careful calculations that had gone into defensive planning had been rendered obsolete by American naval tactics that German intelligence had simply never anticipated. USS Arkansas continued firing throughout the morning, her crew working with the mechanical efficiency that characterized American naval operations. The old battleship's fire control systems, aided by spotter aircraft that radioed corrections back to the ship, walked shells across the German defensive zone with a precision that seemed impossible given the extreme ranges involved. Each salvo followed a pattern, spotting rounds to bracket the target, adjustments based on observer reports, then fire for effect that concentrated multiple shells on positions identified as high-value targets by intelligence analysis and aerial reconnaissance. The experience of being under naval bombardment from positions that were supposed to be safe created psychological effects that matched the physical destruction. Hartmann had endured artillery barrages on the Eastern Front, where German and Soviet guns traded fire across landscapes already reduced to moonscapes by years of combat. But this was different. The shells arrived from an enemy that remained invisible beyond the horizon, fired from platforms that could reposition between salvos while remaining completely immune to counter-battery fire from German coastal guns that lacked the range to reach the American fleet. Private Schmidt abandoned his plotting table as another salvo screamed overhead, the sound building to a crescendo that seemed to compress the air itself inside the bunker. The shells impacted among the artillery park, each 14-inch projectile creating an explosion that lifted German 105mm howitzers and threw them dozens of yards from their carefully prepared positions. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores detonated, creating a chain reaction that consumed an entire battery in minutes. The meticulously organized defensive fire plan with its carefully plotted coordinates and timing sequences collapsed as the physical infrastructure it depended upon was systematically destroyed. The morning wore on, with American battleships maintaining a bombardment that seemed to have no end, their magazines apparently bottomless, and their fire control systems capable of maintaining accuracy even at ranges that stretched the limits of naval artillery. Hartmann watched through his optics as USS Texas joined the bombardment, her 14-inch guns adding to the destruction while demonstrating the same unexpected long-range capabilities that Arkansas had revealed. The two old battleships, veterans of the First World War that German intelligence had dismissed as obsolete, were proving that age mattered less than the innovative tactics and fire control systems that allowed them to engage targets far beyond their designed maximum range. By noon, the German artillery positions that were supposed to dominate the invasion beaches had been reduced to smoking craters and scattered equipment. The observation posts that should have coordinated defensive fire were either destroyed or abandoned, their crews having fled to deeper positions that offered protection from naval shells but no visibility over the tactical situation. The communication networks that connected batteries to observation posts to divisional headquarters had been severed by explosions that created craters large enough to swallow half-track vehicles. The defensive system that had looked so formidable on paper had been dismantled by an enemy that could strike from beyond the range of German weapons. Hartmann counted his remaining men as the afternoon sun beat down on positions that now resembled a wasteland more than a military installation. Of the 42 soldiers who had manned his observation sector that morning, 23 were still combat effective. The others were dead, wounded, or had simply disappeared when their positions took direct hits from shells weighing more than a ton. His communications equipment was partially destroyed, his optical instruments damaged by near misses, and his carefully prepared range cards and fire plans had become meaningless documents that described a battlefield that no longer existed. Most troubling was the realization that this was only the beginning of what promised to be a systematic dismantling of the entire defensive network. The American fleet showed no signs of ceasing its bombardment, and intelligence reports suggested that the ships offshore had brought enough ammunition to sustain this level of fire for days or even weeks. When American infantry finally came ashore, they would advance through a defensive zone that had been methodically destroyed by naval gunfire, that operated far beyond the range German doctrine had considered possible. As evening approached, and the bombardment finally slackened to allow darkness to cover the fleet's repositioning, Hartmann emerged from his bunker to survey what remained of his sector. The landscape was unrecognizable, transformed into overlapping craters and scattered debris that bore little resemblance to the carefully prepared positions he had inherited when the division deployed to Sicily 3 months earlier. Here and there, twisted gun barrels and shattered concrete marked where artillery pieces and bunkers had stood before American shells found them with methodical precision. The stars became visible overhead as smoke from burning ammunition dumps finally cleared, revealing a sky that seemed indifferent to the transformation that had occurred below. But Hartmann took no comfort in their distant light. Tomorrow would bring another day of bombardment from ships that could reach targets the Germans had thought were safe. And when the naval gunfire finally stopped, American infantry would advance across this devastated landscape to complete the destruction of a defensive system that had been rendered obsolete by tactics German intelligence had never anticipated. On the morning of August 8, 1942, Oberleutnant Hartmann crouched in what remained of his observation post and watched American landing craft push toward the Sicilian beaches through a sea that had been transformed into a highway of invasion. The Higgins boats and larger landing craft moved with the confidence of forces that knew the coastal defenses had been systematically destroyed, their crews showing none of the caution that should have characterized an assault against prepared positions. Behind them, the massive shapes of battleships and cruisers maintained their bombardment, but now the shells were falling on targets even deeper inland, reaching positions that German commanders had considered absolutely immune to naval gunfire. The transformation of the tactical situation had occurred with stunning speed, collapsing defensive plans that had taken months to develop and implement. Hartmann's radio, when it functioned at all through the damaged antenna system, brought fragmentary reports of a defensive network in complete disarray. Observation Post 4 reported that USS Nevada's 16-inch guns had found their ammunition dump at 20 miles inland, the resulting explosion creating a crater visible from the coast. Observation Post 9 transmitted that they were abandoning their position after sustained bombardment had collapsed the bunker's eastern wall and killed their forward observer. The Americans had clearly studied the problem of extended-range naval gunfire with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized their approach to industrial warfare. The battleships offshore were not simply firing at maximum elevation and hoping for hits, but employing sophisticated fire control procedures that compensated for the reduced accuracy inherent in extreme-range shooting. Spotter aircraft circled overhead in patterns that kept them out of range of German anti-aircraft guns, while providing real-time corrections to the fleet, creating a coordination between air and naval assets that German forces had never encountered in this form. Lieutenant Klaus Becker, commanding the artillery battery that had been positioned 12 miles inland to provide counter-battery fire against the invasion fleet, reported via runner that his unit had been forced to displace after American naval shells began bracketing their position with alarming accuracy. Becker's message described shells arriving in a pattern that suggested the Americans were systematically working through a target list, eliminating each identified position before moving to the next. The methodical nature of the bombardment reflected an industrial approach to warfare that treated defensive positions as problems to be solved through the application of sufficient firepower and technical expertise. The psychological impact of the bombardment extended beyond its physical destruction to undermine fundamental assumptions about the relationship between naval power and land warfare. German military doctrine had always recognized naval gunfire as a threat to coastal positions, but the ability to reach targets 20 miles inland represented a qualitative change that invalidated established tactical principles. Artillery officers who had positioned their guns based on calculated safety margins now found themselves under fire from an enemy they could neither see nor effectively engage, creating a sense of helplessness that no amount of training had prepared them for. Private Schmidt worked frantically to restore communication with divisional headquarters, splicing damaged cables and adjusting frequencies to compensate for interference from nearby explosions. His efforts finally established contact with Colonel Schmaltz's command post, located in what had been considered a completely safe position 22 miles from the coast. The colonel's voice, distorted by static and the strain of commanding a disintegrating defensive network, delivered orders that acknowledged the collapse of the original defensive plan. All observation posts were to fall back to secondary positions, coordinate with units that might no longer exist, and maintain fire direction for artillery batteries that had been systematically destroyed over the past 24 hours. Hartmann recognized the desperation in these orders, the disconnect between command expectations and battlefield reality that characterized military operations when communications broke down and situational awareness collapsed. Schmaltz was issuing directives based on a mental picture of the battlefield that had ceased to exist hours earlier, trying to coordinate a defense using assets that American naval gunfire had already eliminated. The careful defensive scheme, with its interlocking fields of fire and coordinated counter-battery procedures, had been reduced to scattered groups of soldiers trying to survive in positions that offered no protection from an enemy that could reach them from beyond the horizon. The second day of bombardment revealed patterns in American naval tactics that demonstrated sophisticated planning and exceptional fire control capabilities. USS Arkansas and USS Texas worked in coordination, with one ship firing while the other adjusted based on spotter reports, creating a continuous bombardment that gave defenders no respite. The battleships focused on high-value targets identified through aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence. Command posts, artillery positions, ammunition dumps, and communication nodes that formed the backbone of German defensive coordination. Each target received methodical attention, with spotting rounds followed by adjustments, and then concentrated fire that continued until aerial observers confirmed destruction. The Americans were not conducting random area bombardment, but systematic elimination of specific positions using fire control procedures that achieved remarkable accuracy despite ranges that approached 20 miles. German soldiers who survived the bombardments described shells that seemed to arrive with uncanny precision, impacting within yards of bunker entrances or landing directly on gun positions that aerial camouflage should have concealed. The technical achievement represented by this long-range naval gunfire was remarkable, even by American standards, requiring coordination between multiple systems and careful calculation of ballistic factors that became increasingly complex at extreme ranges. The battleships were firing at elevation angles near their maximum, using reduced propellant charges that sacrificed muzzle velocity for the high trajectory needed to reach distant targets. Fire control computers aboard the ships solved complex equations that accounted for wind, temperature, the rotation of the Earth, and the motion of the ship itself, producing firing solutions that placed shells within acceptable accuracy margins despite ranges that stretched the limits of naval artillery. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, commanding a mixed Kampfgruppe positioned 15 miles inland to serve as a mobile reserve, watched in growing alarm as American naval shells began falling around his assembly area. Weber had positioned his force based on the assumption that naval gunfire could not reach this far from the coast. placing his vehicles in an orange grove that offered concealment from aerial observation while remaining close enough to the beaches to conduct rapid counterattacks. The first shells landed in the grove with results that shattered this tactical calculus. 14-inch projectiles that exploded among the half-tracks and armored cars with devastating effect. The Kampfgruppe had been organized as a quick reaction force, equipped with vehicles and trained for rapid movement to threatened sectors. But American naval gunfire had transformed mobility from an advantage into a liability, as any concentration of vehicles large enough to constitute an effective force also created a target that aerial observers could identify and naval guns could engage. Weber's attempts to disperse his force were complicated by the need to maintain unit cohesion and communication, creating a tactical dilemma
that German doctrine provided no clear answer for. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-afternoon on August 8th, the cumulative effects of sustained naval bombardment had reduced the German defensive network to a state approaching complete collapse. Observation posts that had survived the first day's bombardment were being systematically eliminated as American fire control teams worked through their target lists with methodical efficiency. Artillery batteries that had displaced to alternate positions found themselves under fire within hours as aerial reconnaissance located their new positions and naval guns adjusted accordingly. Communication networks that had been redundant and carefully protected were failing as key nodes took direct hits from shells that created craters large enough to sever multiple cable runs simultaneously. The radio brought news that Observation Post 7 had been completely destroyed by a direct hit from what survivors estimated was a 16-inch shell, the bunker's 3-foot-thick concrete walls proving inadequate against a projectile that weighed over a ton and struck with the kinetic energy of a locomotive. The post's entire crew of 8 men had been killed instantly, buried under tons of shattered concrete and earth when the explosion collapsed the structure. Similar reports arrived from across the defensive sector, each describing the elimination of positions that German engineers had believed could withstand anything short of a direct hit from heavy bomber ordnance. Hartmann made the decision to evacuate his observation post as dusk approached, recognizing that continued occupation would result in the death of his remaining men for no tactical gain. The position could no longer serve its intended function of directing artillery fire, as most of the guns it was supposed to coordinate had been destroyed, and the communication systems needed for fire direction had been knocked out by near misses that had severed cables and damaged radio equipment. Remaining in place meant waiting for the inevitable direct hit that would bury them under concrete and earth, dying for a position that no longer contributed to the defense. The evacuation required moving across open ground, while American spotter aircraft maintained surveillance over the entire sector, exposing the men to observation and potential attack. Hartmann chose to move in small groups during the brief periods when smoke from fires and dust from explosions obscured aerial observation, gambling that the Americans would focus their fire control efforts on higher-value targets. The risk paid off, as his men successfully displaced to a secondary position 3 miles deeper inland, abandoning equipment and supplies that represented months of preparation and logistical effort. The new position offered protection from direct naval gunfire, but no capability to observe or direct fire against the invasion beaches, reducing Hartmann's unit from an active element of the defensive system to mere survivors hiding from an enemy that dominated the battlefield through superior firepower and technical capability. The psychological impact of this reduction was profound, destroying the sense of purpose and tactical relevance that sustained soldiers through combat. They had become irrelevant to the battle's outcome, able neither to influence events nor to escape the consequences of decisions made by commanders who no longer understood the situation they faced. As night fell on August 8th, the American fleet maintained a reduced but continuous bombardment, firing harassing missions that prevented German forces from reorganizing or moving supplies forward to support defensive operations. The naval guns fired at intervals calculated to maximize psychological impact while conserving ammunition for the sustained operations ahead. Each salvo reminded defenders that the Americans could reach any position within 20 miles of the coast, that nowhere was safe from ships that had demonstrated capabilities far beyond what German intelligence had predicted. The morning of August 9th brought news that shattered what remained of German confidence in their defensive preparations. USS Nevada, operating from a position 9 miles offshore, had successfully engaged and destroyed a German artillery position 21 miles inland, setting a new record for effective naval gunfire that seemed to mock every calculation German planners had made about safe distances. The battleship's 16-inch guns, firing at maximum elevation with carefully calculated propellant charges, had placed shells within 50 yards of their target despite the extreme range, demonstrating fire control capabilities that represented the cutting edge of ballistic science. Intelligence reports reaching divisional headquarters described American naval tactics that employed multiple ships in coordinated fire missions, with different vessels engaging separate targets simultaneously while maintaining communication through radio networks that proved resistant to German jamming efforts. The Americans had clearly anticipated the communication challenges of coordinating naval gunfire at extreme ranges, developing procedures and equipment that allowed ships to maintain accurate fire direction, even when operating beyond visual range of their targets. This level of tactical sophistication reflected planning and preparation that had considered problems German forces were only now recognizing. The systematic destruction of the German defensive network continued throughout August 9th and 10th, with American battleships and cruisers working through target lists that had been compiled from aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and interrogation of prisoners captured during preliminary operations. Each identified position received attention proportional to its assessed value, with command posts and artillery batteries receiving sustained bombardment, while lesser targets were engaged with single salvos designed to destroy equipment and demoralize defenders rather than completely eliminate positions. Hauptmann Weber's Kampfgruppe attempted a counterattack on the evening of August 9th, advancing toward American positions that had established themselves on the beaches and begun moving inland. The mobile force made good initial progress, using darkness and terrain to approach within 3 miles of the beachhead before American forces detected their movement. What followed demonstrated another dimension of American naval gunfire capability, as destroyers offshore received fire mission requests from ground forces and responded within minutes with accurate barrages that caught Weber's vehicles on an exposed section of coastal road. The naval gunfire that fell on the Kampfgruppe came not from the battleships that had been bombarding inland positions, but from destroyers equipped with 5-inch guns that fired at rates exceeding 15 rounds per minute. The smaller caliber weapons lacked the range and destructive power of battleship main batteries, but their rapid fire and precise control made them devastating against moving targets. Weber's force lost 6 vehicles in the first minute of bombardment, with survivors scattering into terrain that offered concealment but no protection from shells that followed them with uncanny accuracy, based on spotting reports from forward observers advancing with American infantry. The failed counterattack demonstrated that American naval gunfire had extended beyond strategic bombardment of rear area targets to provide tactical support for ground forces advancing inland. German commanders who had planned their defensive operations based on the assumption that naval guns could only affect coastal areas now faced an enemy that could call down accurate fire support from ships operating miles offshore. This capability fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of defensive warfare. eliminating the depth that German doctrine relied upon to conduct mobile defense and counterattacks against amphibious landings. By August 12, 1942, Oberleutnant Hartmann commanded a unit that existed only in the most technical sense. A collection of 18 men scattered across 3 miles of Sicilian countryside, with no functional equipment, no communication with higher headquarters, and no realistic ability to influence the battle's outcome. The German defensive network that had promised to make the Allied invasion of Sicily a costly undertaking had been systematically dismantled by naval gunfire that operated at ranges German planners had considered impossible, reducing organized resistance to scattered groups of soldiers hiding in whatever cover they could find. The transformation of the battlefield exceeded anything Hartmann had witnessed during 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front, where the grinding attrition of the Russian campaign had at least followed recognizable patterns of advance and retreat, attack and counterattack. Here in Sicily, the Americans had imposed a new form of warfare that eliminated the defenders' traditional advantages through the simple expedient of firing over them from positions they could not reach. The careful preparation of defensive positions, the stockpiling of ammunition, the training of artillery crews, all had been rendered meaningless by an enemy that could destroy infrastructure faster than it could be employed. Private Schmidt, who had not slept in 3 days, sat against a stone wall in a farmhouse cellar that provided the group's current refuge. The young soldier had developed a nervous habit of flinching at any loud noise, his body trained by 4 days of bombardment to anticipate the arrival of shells that could come from any direction at any time. Schmidt's transformation from confident artilleryman to shell-shocked survivor reflected the broader psychological collapse that had spread through German forces as they realized the helplessness of their tactical situation. The radio, cobbled together from salvaged components and powered by a battery Schmidt had carried 3 miles on his back, occasionally captured fragments of German communications that painted a picture of comprehensive defeat. A panzer unit reported losing 12 tanks to naval gunfire while attempting to move forward to support the coastal defense, the American spotters having identified their assembly area and called down fire from cruisers whose 8-inch guns proved devastatingly effective against armored vehicles caught in the open. An infantry regiment transmitted that they were abandoning their prepared positions after sustained bombardment had made them untenable, falling back to positions that offered no fields of fire, but at least provided protection from the shells that seemed to follow them wherever they concentrated. Divisional headquarters, now operating from a position 25 miles inland that had once seemed absurdly distant from any conceivable naval threat, issued orders that bore no relation to the tactical realities facing units in contact with American forces. The directive spoke of coordinated counterattacks and the importance of holding key terrain, as if the careful defensive plans developed during months of preparation remained relevant in a battlefield environment where American ships could reach any position within 20 miles of the coast. The disconnect between command expectations and unit capabilities had grown so complete that many officers simply stopped reporting their true situations, recognizing that accurate assessments would only generate orders they had no capacity to execute. Hartmann listened to these transmissions with the detachment of a man who had already accepted the inevitability of defeat, recognizing that the Battle of Sicily had been decided not by the courage or tactical skill of the forces involved, but by American technological capabilities that had invalidated the fundamental assumptions underlying German defensive doctrine. The naval gunfire that had reached 21 miles inland represented more than just an impressive technical achievement. It demonstrated an approach to warfare that treated range and firepower as problems to be solved through engineering and systematic application of resources. The few German artillery batteries that remained operational attempted to engage American positions, but their efforts proved futile against an enemy that could respond with overwhelming firepower delivered from platforms the German guns could not reach.
A battery commander reported expending his entire ammunition reserve in a 2-hour fire mission against American troop concentrations, only to have his position identified by counter-battery radar and destroyed by naval gunfire within 20 minutes of his last shot. The asymmetry of the engagement was complete. German artillery could fire at American ground forces, but faced immediate and devastating retaliation from ships that remained invulnerable to counter-battery fire. The breakthrough came on August 13th, when American armored units, supported by continuous naval gunfire that cleared defensive positions ahead of their advance, penetrated the German lines and began exploiting toward the interior of Sicily. The mobile forces encountered scattered resistance from German units that had survived the bombardment, but the absence of coordinated defensive fire and the constant threat of naval bombardment prevented the kind of organized defense that might have slowed the American advance. Hartmann watched from a hillside observation position as American Sherman tanks rolled past positions that should have been defended by the Kampfgruppe that had been destroyed during its attempted counterattack 4 days earlier. The speed of the American advance reflected their confidence in naval gunfire support that could reach far beyond the immediate tactical area, providing security against German counterattacks, even as American forces penetrated deep into terrain that traditional doctrine would have considered dangerous for armored units operating beyond the range of friendly artillery. The tanks moved with the assurance of forces that knew any significant German concentration would be identified and destroyed by naval gunfire before it could threaten the advance, fundamentally altering the risk calculations that normally governed armored operations. Hauptmann Weber, whose Kampfgruppe had been reduced to fewer than 40 men and 3 operational vehicles, attempted to organize an ambush against the American column. But aerial observers spotted his force as it moved into position, and within 15 minutes naval shells were impacting around his location with accuracy that suggested the Americans had real-time intelligence on German dispositions. Weber abandoned the ambush attempt and ordered his men to disperse into the countryside, recognizing that any concentration large enough to pose a threat to American forces would simply draw fire from ships that dominated the battlefield, despite being miles from the fighting. The psychological impact of sustained naval bombardment manifested in ways that transcended simple fear of death, eroding the cohesion and discipline that held military units together under stress. Soldiers who had endured Russian artillery on the Eastern Front found the naval bombardment qualitatively different, more impersonal and inescapable than even the massive Soviet barrages they had survived. The shells arrived without warning from an enemy they could not see, fired by crews who were completely safe from retaliation, creating a sense of helplessness that no amount of courage could overcome. Corporal Heinrich Müller, a veteran of the French campaign who had transferred to coastal defense duty, approached Hartmann on the evening of August 14th, with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Herr Oberleutnant," Müller said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I have fought in Poland, France, and Russia. I have been under artillery fire that lasted for hours. But this is different. The Americans can hit us anywhere, anytime, and we cannot fight back. We are not soldiers anymore. We are just targets waiting for shells that we cannot escape." The breakdown of unit cohesion accelerated as word spread through the German defensive network about the extent of American naval gunfire capabilities. Units that had maintained discipline through days of bombardment began to fragment as soldiers made individual decisions to abandon positions that offered no protection and served no tactical purpose. Officers who tried to maintain defensive positions found themselves commanding ever smaller groups as men slipped away during darkness, seeking safety in dispersal rather than the concentration that military doctrine demanded, but that American naval gunfire punished with systematic destruction. By August 16th, organized German resistance in western Sicily had effectively ceased,
with American forces advancing against scattered opposition that lacked the coordination or firepower to significantly delay the invasion. The defensive network that had been constructed over months of effort had been dismantled in less than 2 weeks by naval gunfire that had proven capable of reaching targets far beyond the ranges German intelligence had predicted. The Hermann Goering Division, which had deployed to Sicily as an elite formation intended to throw the invasion back into the sea, had been reduced to scattered Kampfgruppen, hiding from an enemy that controlled the battlefield through technological superiority rather than numerical advantage. The final transmission Hartmann received from divisional headquarters came on August 17th, delivered in a code that indicated the message's sensitive nature. All units were released from their current positions and authorized to withdraw toward defensive lines being established in eastern Sicily, abandoning the western portion of the island to American forces whose advance had become unstoppable. The order represented an admission of comprehensive defeat, acknowledging that the defensive plan had failed not through lack of courage or tactical errors, but because American capabilities had exceeded every assumption upon which German planning had been based. As darkness fell on August 17th, Hartmann gathered his remaining men and began the long withdrawal toward positions that might or might not still exist. The landscape they moved through bore the scars of naval bombardment that had transformed familiar terrain into a moonscape of overlapping craters and shattered infrastructure. Here and there, the wreckage of German artillery pieces and vehicles marked where American naval gunfire had found its targets with the methodical precision that had characterized the entire operation. The evidence of systematic destruction extended for miles, a testament to firepower that had operated at ranges that redefined the relationship between naval and land warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. On September 3, 1942, as Allied forces completed their conquest of Sicily and prepared for the invasion of mainland Italy, Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann sat in a British prisoner of war camp near Syracuse and tried to comprehend the implications of what he had witnessed during the campaign. The interrogation officers who questioned him showed particular interest in German perceptions of American naval gunfire capabilities, taking detailed notes as Hartmann described shells that had reached 21 miles inland and fire control that had achieved remarkable accuracy despite extreme ranges. The British intelligence officers explained that the Americans had developed specialized techniques for extended-range naval bombardment, using mathematical fire control solutions and aerial spotting to compensate for the reduced accuracy inherent in extreme-range shooting. The battleships had fired at elevation angles approaching 45 degrees, using reduced propellant charges that sacrificed muzzle velocity for the high trajectory needed to reach distant targets. Spotter aircraft had provided real-time corrections, creating a coordination between air and naval assets that allowed ships to engage targets with precision that would have been impossible using shipboard observation alone. The technical achievement represented by this capability reflected broader American advantages in fire control technology, mathematical computation, and inter-service cooperation that German forces had consistently underestimated throughout the war. The United States Navy had invested heavily in developing fire control systems that could solve complex ballistic equations in real time, producing firing solutions that accounted for dozens of variables affecting shell trajectory at extreme ranges. When combined with aerial observation and radio communication systems that allowed rapid transmission of spotting corrections, these capabilities had produced a weapons system that fundamentally altered the tactical geography of amphibious warfare. Hartmann's interrogators revealed statistics that underscored the scale of naval gunfire's impact on the Sicily campaign. American battleships and cruisers had fired over 60,000 rounds during the invasion, with approximately 15,000 shells landing on targets more than 15 miles inland. The sustained bombardment had destroyed an estimated 70% of German artillery positions, 85% of observation posts, and virtually all ammunition dumps located within 20 miles of the coast. These losses had occurred before American ground forces made significant contact with German defensive positions, demonstrating that naval gunfire alone could achieve tactical objectives that would traditionally have required weeks of ground combat. The psychological impact of the naval bombardment extended beyond immediate participants to influence German defensive planning throughout the Mediterranean theater and eventually across all potential invasion fronts. Reports from Sicily circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters, describing American capabilities that exceeded German understanding of naval artillery and forcing a fundamental reassessment of defensive doctrine for opposing amphibious operations. The assumption that artillery and command positions could be safely located beyond naval gun range had been shattered, requiring new approaches to defensive deployment that acknowledged American ability to reach targets previously considered invulnerable. Private Schmidt, recovering in the same POW camp after having been captured during the withdrawal from western Sicily, developed chronic anxiety that manifested in violent reactions to any sudden noise. The young soldier had been diagnosed with what British medical officers called shell shock, a psychological condition that had become increasingly common among German soldiers who had endured extended naval bombardment. Schmidt's symptoms included insomnia, hypervigilance, and intrusive memories of shells arriving without warning from an enemy he could never see, psychological scars that would persist long after the physical wounds of combat had healed. The post-war analysis of the Sicily campaign identified American naval gunfire as the decisive factor in the invasion's rapid success, with military historians calculating that the bombardment had reduced the duration of the campaign by at least 4 weeks, while minimizing Allied casualties. The ability to reach targets 20 miles inland had allowed American forces to destroy German defensive infrastructure before it could be effectively employed, creating conditions for rapid advance that would have been impossible if naval gunfire had been limited to coastal positions. This tactical innovation had strategic implications that extended far beyond Sicily to influence planning for future amphibious operations throughout the European theater. The development of extended-range naval bombardment techniques reflected broader American advantages in applying industrial and scientific resources to military problems, creating capabilities that exceeded those of adversaries who possessed comparable basic technology, but lacked the systematic approach to innovation that characterized American warfare. The fire control computers, aerial observation procedures, and inter-service coordination that enabled 20-mile bombardments had all existed in rudimentary form before the Sicily campaign, but American forces had refined and integrated these elements into a weapon system whose effectiveness exceeded the sum of its components. Hauptmann Weber, who had survived the destruction of his Kampfgruppe and eventually reached German lines in eastern Sicily, provided detailed after-action reports that influenced Wehrmacht tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. Weber's analysis emphasized the futility of concentrating forces within range of American naval guns, recommending dispersal and mobility as the only viable defense against an enemy that could identify and destroy any significant concentration of German assets. These recommendations shaped German defensive tactics during subsequent Allied landings in Italy and France, though the fundamental problem of American firepower superiority remained unsolved throughout the conflict. The technical lessons learned from Sicily influenced American naval operations for the remainder of World War II and beyond, with extended-range bombardment becoming a standard capability employed during invasions of Italy, southern France, and the Pacific Islands. The procedures developed for coordinating naval gunfire with aerial observation and ground force requirements became increasingly sophisticated, eventually enabling ships to provide fire support dozens of miles inland during operations in Korea and Vietnam. The precedent established during the Sicily campaign demonstrated that naval power could influence land warfare far beyond coastal areas, fundamentally altering strategic calculations about the projection of force from sea to shore. Dr. Theodore Westphal, a civilian mathematician who had developed many of the fire control algorithms employed by American battleships, later described the Sicily bombardments as validation of theoretical work that had begun years before the war. Westphal's equations had predicted that carefully calculated high-angle fire could extend naval gun ranges by 40 to 50% beyond normal maximum ranges, though achieving useful accuracy at such distances required integration of aerial observation and rapid communication of corrections. The successful employment of these techniques during actual combat operations confirmed Westphal's mathematical models while demonstrating that theoretical capabilities could be translated into practical battlefield advantages through systematic application of resources and training. The strategic implications of American naval gunfire capabilities extended beyond tactical advantages to influence broader questions about the nature of warfare in an era of rapid technological change. The ability to reach targets 20 miles inland represented a qualitative shift in the relationship between naval and land power, suggesting that traditional distinctions between maritime and terrestrial warfare were becoming increasingly artificial. This blurring of boundaries between different forms of military power would accelerate throughout the Cold War period as precision-guided munitions and cruise missiles further extended the reach of naval weapons into areas traditionally dominated by land-based forces. Lieutenant Tanaka Hiroshi, a Japanese naval attaché who had observed portions of the Sicily campaign from neutral territory, filed reports with Imperial headquarters that emphasized the revolutionary nature of American naval bombardment capabilities. Tanaka's analysis warned that similar techniques could be employed during potential Allied invasions of Japanese-held territories, recommending defensive deployments that placed critical assets beyond the 20-mile range that American battleships had demonstrated in Sicily. These recommendations influenced Japanese defensive planning for the Philippines and Okinawa, though the fundamental challenge of American firepower superiority remained unresolved as the Pacific War progressed toward its conclusion. The human cost of the naval bombardment during Sicily extended beyond immediate casualties to include thousands of soldiers who survived physically but carried psychological scars that would affect them for decades after the war's conclusion. The experience of being targeted by weapons they could neither see nor effectively counter had created trauma that transcended the physical danger of combat, striking at soldiers' sense of agency and their ability to influence their own survival through skill or courage. This psychological dimension of naval bombardment would be recognized by later generations of military psychologists as a significant factor in combat stress reactions among personnel exposed to sustained artillery and aerial attack. Friedrich Hartmann returned to Germany in 1947 after 4 years in British custody, carrying with him memories of a campaign that had demonstrated the obsolescence of defensive tactics he had been trained to employ. His post-war career as an engineer allowed him to apply the technical knowledge he had developed during military service, but he never fully reconciled himself to the transformation of warfare he had witnessed in Sicily. Hartmann's private journals described recurring dreams of shells arriving from beyond the horizon, fired by an enemy whose technological superiority had made traditional military virtues of courage and tactical skill increasingly irrelevant to battlefield outcomes. The legacy of American naval gunfire in Sicily established precedents for the projection of firepower that would influence military doctrine throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The demonstration that ships could effectively engage targets 20 miles inland fundamentally altered strategic calculations about amphibious warfare and the role of naval forces in supporting ground operations. The techniques developed during the Sicily campaign evolved into increasingly sophisticated fire support systems that extended the reach of naval weapons to hundreds of miles through the employment of cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. overwhelming firepower delivered from platforms the enemy could not effectively counter. The questions raised by the Sicily campaign about the relationship between technology and military effectiveness remained relevant long after the specific tactical innovations of 1942 had been superseded by new capabilities. The American ability to extend naval gun ranges beyond German expectations had demonstrated that superior technology could overcome defensive advantages, built on assumptions about physical limitations that proved less absolute than defenders had believed. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly throughout subsequent conflicts as new technologies consistently exceeded the expectations of those who planned defenses based on existing capabilities rather than potential innovations. The transformation of naval warfare that began with extended-range bombardment during the Sicily campaign accelerated throughout the post-war period as guided missiles, satellite navigation, and computer fire control systems further extended the reach and accuracy of ship-based weapons. The battleships that had fired at 21 miles during Sicily were eventually replaced by cruisers and destroyers that could engage targets hundreds of miles inland with Tomahawk cruise missiles. But the conceptual breakthrough remained the same. Naval power could influence land warfare far beyond coastal areas through the systematic application of technology and firepower. The precedent established during August 1942 continued to shape naval doctrine and force structure decisions into the 21st century, demonstrating that tactical innovations developed during wartime often had strategic implications that extended far beyond their immediate battlefield applications.